So everyone here is for the technology roadmap session. If you've been to one of these before in the past year, I do like to make them a little bit interactive so that as we sort of talk about some of the big areas that we're going to be focusing on 2019 around technology, that it literally turns into a little bit of a conversation so we can get some feedback from you, I can take some notes, and we can get some of your ideas and suggestions as well. If you were, again, at the plenary this morning, you'll know that a big focus for next year is around a very significant overhaul around data, audience selection, reporting, downloadable reports, canned reports. And again, we really want to have a huge amount of input from all of you to be able to make sure that we can do that whole reconstruction process in a way which meets your needs. So not just to sort of dive into that right away, but for those of you that don't know me, my name is Graham Covington. I'm the founder CEO of Engaging Networks, and I oversee our technology primarily from a strategic point of view in terms of making decisions around what technology we develop, prioritizing technology, managing the leadership of the technology team throughout the year. There's basically three of us really that kind of form a core group. There's the CTO for Hot Noor, who was at the Partners Day yesterday. I don't think he's here today. He's very much a back-end Java engineer. That's his experience. And then, of course, there's Dan Semchek, who many of you might know because he actually years ago, almost 10 years ago when he joined the company, he was in client support. But he had a very strong technical background, and so he eventually kind of grew into this role of overseeing some of the product implementation or development implementation. And so he works primarily with the front-end developers, all the guys like Simon and Ian, who are developing UI implementations, et cetera, et cetera. So there's basically Dan for Hot and myself, just to kind of give you a bit of background about how we work. And what we like to do is start off the year with a technology roadmap, a list of features, individual product enhancements, whatever. They don't tend to get too deep into the weeds, but we want to have a good idea of the major chunks, both in terms of features or new products that we want to deliver over the course of the coming calendar year. We try and get that completely cemented by January. We're a very agile company, so we typically have a release cycle every 6 to 8 weeks when we will be releasing either, again, new major modules or features or enhancements or even bug fixes. And what we do is we keep something called a product journal. The tech guys hate this. The tech guys they use Jira, and they use Jira to manage all their tickets and exchange notes and make sure they've got all the QA cycles working and everything else. But I want something written in English. So I created something called a product journal where we literally start off the year as a Word document with everything that we want to implement over the course of the calendar year, and we make selections around what we want out of that for the first release, the second release, and we kind of keep managing it as we go throughout the year. So it's a very kind of agile, very fluid kind of process that we use. And last year we actually published the product journal. So we created a PDF file of everything that we released in each of the various releases throughout the year, which we'll do again this year. We'll basically release that to you so you can kind of see what we get up to. There's a lot of stuff around timing and prioritization. A lot of people will ask, for example, oh, why don't you do this? And why don't you do this now? From a technology point of view, the most logical and sensible way to develop technology is to do it so that you are grouping things that touch the same code base or data infrastructure at the same time. So, for example, when we did our master dashboard, one of the things which was done earlier this year, that involved a lot of sharing, so that organizations that have multiple sub-accounts can essentially do things like share pages, share templates, aggregate data, roll up reporting, etc. It was super successful, but because we wanted templates as something that we wanted to share, we just bit the bullet and decided to make templates generically, something that you could edit and build. So in terms of template, when I talk about templates, when you build a page using Page Builder, up until this year, you've gone in and you've had an HTML wrapper, or what I call a template, but basically the wrapper that's always been in, obviously, HTML, and there's really been no easy way to actually make visual changes in the wrapper without actually going in and changing the HTML. You could do that with the contents that you dragged into the wrapper, So that's what Page Builder is all about, putting in form blocks and questions and images and text blocks and whatever. But we decided to actually make the wrappers themselves sort of as an on-page editor, so that someone who doesn't have any technical expertise could go in and look at a wrapper and say, hey, I'd like to change the colors, I'd like to move the footer around, I'd like to do this, I'd like to do whatever. The reason we did that with the master dashboard is because the master dashboard, one of the functions was actually sharing templates. And there was no point sharing templates unless they could be easily online editable for local organizations that didn't have technical skills. So that's the way we think about it when we actually group things together. We try and do things that actually work well together at the same time, because it means that we can be more efficient with the engineering resource because they're doing things. And so sometimes you might think, well, why on earth did they prioritize that? Well, it actually made a huge amount of sense to do that then, as opposed to 6 months later when perhaps it was less important or less relevant. In terms of what we put on the roadmap and how we prioritize things, it's a bit of a collaborative, sort of conflictual, happy, unhappy process. It's something where commercially we feel that we need to develop certain things because it's important for us vis-a-vis our competitors. Obviously, we want to make sure that we're only producing things that are going to be effective at serving your needs ultimately. So we definitely have our own commercial priorities about what we decide to actually prioritize within the technology roadmap. But we also, probably more so than any other company, listen to you. You'll let us know, if, for example, we've missed the mark on something, or if you think that, the technology needs something else. Yesterday's partner day with our agency partners was a great example of that. Partners were saying, hey, have you guys thought about doing this? Today's keynote was another great example where people are kind of raising their hands saying, hey, have you thought about that? And so we love to listen to your suggestions because we know that we're essentially serving you and we're serving our customers in doing that. What we typically try and stay away from are things that are going to be very, very narrow in their utility. So if someone says, hey, can you build something that's going to do this? We stay away completely for building things that are one-off applications for an individual client on top of the code base. Everything that gets done in Engaging Networks gets done as part of the core product. I know that there are other companies that will sometimes say, hey, yeah, we've got this client and we're going to create some custom code for them so that the software application works differently for them than it does for everybody else to satisfy their needs, because they're going to pay us to do that. That creates an absolute mess and a horror show. So what our focus is to develop technology that is flexible enough that it can meet everyone's own versions of their implementation. So in other words, we don't want to create something that's rigid to begin with. We want to create something that's flexible and sophisticated so that when we put it out there, if people want to do different things with it, they're able to do it, but without creating a huge amount of custom code within the core application. So if someone does come to us and say, hey, what about this? And we know it's very specific to their needs and it's not going to really serve the client base on a broader level, we're likely to deprioritize that because obviously it's something which is very highly focused. But usually though, especially for our enterprise clients who have a lot of experience using obviously different types of technology, when we get suggestions from them, we know immediately, for example, that that's probably something that's going to be extremely useful for everybody else. And so it's kind of a useful process to go through. One of our downloadable reports, which measures the ROI for your email campaigns, that was a format given to us by an organization that is hyper-organized, a client, hyper-organized in terms of how they report their ROI for their email campaigns. And so that downloadable report actually is credit to one client that actually really had their act together when it came down to understanding how to report the metrics for their email campaigns. So it's a little messy. I think it is for every company that develops software. You have to make decisions, but basically we listen to you, we think about our own commercial needs, we group things together in terms of timing and planning. In terms of innovation, we are constantly thinking about what you're going to need, but I don't know if you've heard of the expression, the bleeding edge. You never want to be on the bleeding edge of technology, you want to be on the leading edge of technology, but I learned many, many years ago that when you start developing technology that you think is going to be super innovative, change the world, etc., if you're too far ahead of the curve, no one's going to use it, and you're going to sit there and produce something which by the time actually people do want to start using it, you've probably lost a huge cycle of development and innovation, and so you're back basically recreating it anyway. To give you an example, the whole concept of cryptocurrencies, obviously, and the underlying concept of blockchain are fascinating. I don't think they're anywhere close to being anything mainstream, and I really can't yet think of any very specific use cases in the nonprofit sector where that could be something extremely useful, but it's out there. So we're thinking about it, we're watching it, we're sort of seeing how it's being implemented, and then we'll when the time is right and we think there's an appetite for it, then we'll start building things. So we like to be out there. Always thinking, for example, we implemented Apple Pay for a couple of organizations that wanted to try it. They really didn't get a huge amount of uptake on it, and so that's a little bit of a fail for us because actually, for the time being, it's really not that useful in terms of processing payments. So, it's that kind of friction between wanting to be where you need to be with technology, but not necessarily so far ahead of the curve that you're building stuff that no one's going to use, because that's resource that we can more efficiently now use to do something which is going to be useful. What else can I say about tech, how our overall planning works? So we have a good system. We have a fantastic team, Oracle DBAs, people on network infrastructure, development operations team, front-end developers, back-end engineers, and we've actually now got, and I'm going to talk about our machine learning and AI program, but we've now got also our first data scientist, Gordon Walsh, and we're building out the team also on the AI side as well. From right now we have Melis, Hannah, Dwayne, and Gordon, and that group of 4 on the machine learning team is going to start expanding as well at the beginning of next year. Any questions, conversation, discussion about that, about how we kind of go about building our technology? No? If you've obviously been on the platform, you will know that you get this constant stream of obviously changes and updates and so on to the product. And that's never going to change. Again, I'm just going to reiterate what I said this morning, which is that we as a company philosophically believe that as a subscription service, the money that you are paying to us is really an obligation on our part to make sure that that money is being reinvested into the ongoing development of your product. So it's not a product that we're developing, installing, and then charging a maintenance fee. Because we charge a subscription, we have an obligation to basically constantly maintain, update, and improve that product for you. This is not a traditional install and go away model. SaaS applications need to constantly make sure that they are changing, evolving, and meeting your needs. And so we take that very seriously. That's an underlying core philosophy at Engaging Networks. Questions? No? Don't be shy. All right, okay. All right, so very quickly, I'm just going to go through again some of the main things that we did in 2018. I know the year is not up. We just had a release on Friday. We have one more release before we do the code freeze for year-end fundraising. We don't like to touch the code base. Obviously, when you guys are in your peak moments, sending out emails and hopefully making lots of money. And so we have this release that went out Friday. This is actually it was a little bit unique. There was a number of things that went in this release, but quite frankly, this release was very much about the e-commerce module. So the e-commerce module got pushed out, but it was a big enough section, and basically as an application, it was complex enough that we decided to isolate that so that we didn't have too many developers working on different things than having to basically bring the code base all back together again. So that's fairly rare. Normally we have a larger number of items that we put into a single release, but Friday's was basically focused on e-commerce. There's also from this Friday, the one thing that we know is being built around for the last release of the year is basically migration of the membership pages into Page Builder. So that's the last page type from legacy pages that's being pulled into Page Builder, and that will come in the final release of this year. The other thing that we are building now is the click-to-call technology for advocacy, but that we're not going to try and push that out and do it with membership. It's too much in terms of the QA cycles. So we're going to actually keep working on it to year end, but probably release it in January. So there's some stuff this year that's in development that basically then doesn't make the last release, the production release. It'll make the first release basically the following year. Yeah.
Is the e-commerce separately licensed or is it built in?
It's a separate module, but I think for most organizations, if you've got a current subscription, you want to try it out, we'd be more than happy for you to go ahead and try it out. And then, but it is going to be similar to events or whatever. It's essentially a separate module. It's built in Page Builder, but it is a big enough component that yeah, but very modestly priced, I'm sure. Any other questions?
Just
Yep.
speaking as an
Yeah.
organization that's really new to engaging with
Yes.
them, how do you know when something like this rolls out? Is there an alert on your dashboard? Is there...
Yep, there's release notes. Basically, usually the way that we, well, not usually, the way that we communicate it is we issue the release notes, and then
Is that email or is that on the dashboard?
that's email. There is a notification that can happen also on the dashboard. Ben is not here, is he? So, was that? Yeah, and you have all the release notes, and then there's.
This is not like something we've been receiving, which is why I was...
Oh, well, yeah, you definitely want to get those for sure. And Ben's the guy to let know if you need to be on that list. But yeah, we basically push out release notes. What we try and do is be very careful about anything that's going to disrupt a workflow, so that if we're doing something that all of a sudden you're going to go, wait, how did this happen, or where did this come from? We don't want that happening, so we want to give you more advanced notice. But if we're adding features like e-commerce, no one's using e-commerce, so we can release e-commerce, and then we can tell you about e-commerce because it's not going to disrupt anyone's use of the technology. So the way that we distinguish when we do release is to make sure that anything that basically could have an impact on some established workflows versus something that's new that no one's using, we kind of manage the communication differently around those two things. Because one, we want to give you more advance warning. The other ones, we basically want to do things like schedule webinars and so on after the fact, because there's no urgency to sort of letting you know in advance. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So very quickly for 2018, what time do we have till? Sorry, I should know this. It's my session, but what time do we have till, John? Till 3? 3 p.m. Okay, good. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go through some of the things that we did in 2018. The reason that I want to go through some of these things in 2018 is because it's going to give you a sense of the volume of, or the number of things that we do in any given year. This is essentially a tool behind our master dashboard. Again, I talked about this a little bit at the plenary. The master dashboard is, you guys all have one technically, because that's the way the software is architected. So whenever you create an account, there's always a master account that exists above that. But if you don't have more than one account under that same umbrella, you don't need to access the master account because you're in your account. So it's a one-to-one relationship. But the reason that we created that architecture of having a master account with individual sub-accounts where data records are independent of each other is that we do have international organizations like Greenpeace that use us in 30 countries. So by putting them all under the same umbrella, there's the potential at least to be able to tie certain things together under that umbrella. The same thing applies to, for example, a national organization that might have local chapters or state-based organizations, or even affiliate. We actually have some clients that might have sort of affiliated organizations that they want to bring in and provide some access to technology for them as well. So just so that you know, in terms of the basic structure of engaging networks, every account has a master account. And the reason that we did that, again, is the example of Greenpeace or a national organization with local or state chapters or whatever. We really wanted to be able to allow collaboration. We wanted those accounts to be able to share. And initially, the first things that we released, actually in last year's roadmap, were the data transfers and data deduping. So if you, for example, if you're a Greenpeace International and you've got records that come in from someone from Canada, but you want the marketing communication really to come from Greenpeace Canada, within the master dashboard, you can set up rules and say, well, if country equals Canada, transfer this record to Greenpeace Canada. So there was a certain amount of sort of data management that goes on. And there's obviously rules around that in terms of GDPR and other things where they would really need to ask those individuals to opt back into their list, et cetera. But that's a separate issue. It's nothing we can really deal with from a technology point of view. So basically managing data is one. The other aspect of that was aggregated reporting. So the idea that you can actually pull together a report and look at if you're sharing a petition across a bunch of organizations, you want to see the total number of petition signers across all of those organizations and not just yours, and then having to manually add it to somebody else's and do all that. So the idea behind that was to also apply it to these display widgets, which you have in Page Builder, where you're showing, for example, dynamically the number of people that have signed a petition or taken an action or for a fundraising campaign that you're running, et cetera. So that was the initial implementation of the master dashboard. But this year, again, we wanted to make sure that we now got into content sharing so that someone could say, hey, at the master level, we're going to create a page for our climate change campaign. And now anybody who's got a local account gets basically offered the opportunity to use a community asset. So the community assets appear in the software, and you can basically just copy it to your account. So now because for example, the data structure for each of those sub-accounts might be different. Someone might have an additional series of constituent fields that they typically use in a form, others may not. So what you do is you essentially create something at the master level. It becomes available to all the account users and they can just grab it. And if it's a page, then for example, when you pull up the page, it shows all the form fields and we automatically map them to what we think are logically the same tagged fields within that local account. But if the organization wants to, they can change the tags and then just basically save it. So now they have basically their own version of this shared resource in their own local account. The same thing applies to templates as well. As I mentioned earlier, we've done it now for page wrappers, but also full pages. So now there's a lot of really fun opportunity for an organization. I was thinking actually of some groups as well that I know in the past they've had like sort of recipient countries where they're working to raise money in the UK, the US, Canada, wherever, but they're actually have these recipient countries where the money is being spent, but gradually they want those countries to start becoming more responsible for raising money locally, but may not have the technical expertise to be able to do it. They might not have the staff to do it. So this is a great opportunity for them to give them access to an account where they don't have to think everything through. They don't have to know the complexities of the software. They can just grab shared resources, add them to their account, make some cosmetic changes through the on-page editor, and then basically get the pages out there. So the same thing for local chapters. Local chapters of a national organization might not have a big team that can do this kind of thing. So Master Dashboard was a big part of the early development of this year. The other thing that happened earlier on the year was a lot of stuff related to GDPR, which I'm sure everyone's heard about at this point, which is the General Data Protection Regulations of the EU. And we needed to make sure that we enhanced some of the functionality within the software to make sure that there were better audit trails for figuring out when someone opted in, what the actual writing was. Like, for example, if someone opts in and then someone changed the opt-in question previously, you'd know that they were opted in, but you wouldn't actually have the specific language used if the actual question was updated. So now we basically audit and track all of that stuff. So now an organization can say, yep, you opted in on this date, and because you opted in on this date, here's the wording of the question, when you opted in, blah, 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 and all the rest of it. So there's a bunch of stuff for GDPR that we did. There's also things that we're going to be doing in 2019, which normally we didn't publish in the roadmap, but they're still fairly important, that relate to GDPR. So for example, if you have not had any significant engagement under GDPR with an individual contact for a certain period of time, then basically GDPR says you really shouldn't keep their data if you're not engaging with them. It's very vague as to what that time frame is, and everyone's got a very different view on what they think that means. But we thought actually it'd be really nice to have sort of an auto-expire kind of process where we could flag up records that essentially have had no engagement either with email or anything else over a period of time, so that at least the client can then go in and make a decision as to whether or not they choose to retain that record or not. So there's some more stuff we're going to be doing in 2019 around GDPR, but it also is one of the things that took up a lot of time earlier this year. This is the e-commerce. This is actually a comp from the e-commerce module before it was built and released on Friday. I suspect that no one was in there on Saturday morning setting up your virtual shops. So you probably haven't seen any of this yet, but we are pretty excited about it because it's a a really nice opportunity to set up, essentially you build an inventory of items that you want to sell on your e-commerce shop. And when you set up that inventory, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can customize when you're creating that inventory. And then you can actually pull those, just like drag and drop. It's all done through Page Builder, same technology, same process. You're just pulling different stuff into the page. And in this case now you can pull different items in that people can then look at, expand, select, buy, and then there's a checkout process basically when they do that. And obviously there's a separate data definition for people that are buying things through e-commerce versus making donations or doing whatever. So I actually have not seen this since it's been put into production release. And you can add things like descriptions, change colors, not change colors, but you can add images with different colors, etc. There's sharing options, there's all kinds of stuff. So it's kind of fun. We're curious to see how people are going to use it for virtual gifts. And the idea in 2019 is to now actually have this applied to physical gifts, actual gifts, so that people can order t-shirts and they can be shipped t-shirts. But it was kind of the whole logistics around shipping and how that gets receipted and everything else that we kind of went, all right, this is a little more complicated than we thought. So we decided to actually just get out the infrastructure, get out the framework, and then we'll basically we've sort of created the initial release in such a way that for actual physical gifts and shipping of those physical gifts, once we sort out things like shipping costs, how they're added, et cetera, managing the inventory, tracking, et cetera, we're probably likely to use a third party for some of that, as opposed to, obviously trying to build everything ourselves, which is not necessary. So that's still kind of being debated and discussed, but certainly that side of this is going to be released in the first half of 2019. This is the stuff around gift strings. Again, these are just a few images that we put together. We just wanted to make sure that we created a slightly more sophisticated approach for you to be able to create dynamic asking strings and suggested gifts for an individual supporter. The fact that we actually process an endless number of currencies made things slightly more complicated. So we basically had to take currency out of the way that we actually created this system, which was a little bit challenging, but we managed to find, I think, a pretty seamless way of doing that. But the idea is that you can create, for example, dynamic asking strings with suggested gift, but you can vary the asking string based on, for example, the actual level of the highest previous contribution, et cetera. So you can actually not only just create one string with one value, you can do a lot of stuff with it, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but basically this has been implemented now, and we're also doing some stuff around this on our machine learning program as well. We introduced a few CRM functions as well this year, or CRM-like functions, where, for example, we have this process now for being able to find duplicates. So there are controls within your account that allow you to set your comfort level and how you want to match data, or what you think might be duplicate records within the account. So there's a client kind of account level setting that you can go in and manage. Once you've done that, I think, and you turn on the process, we just go through and now try using the fuzzy match, essentially try and find records that we think are duplicate records. It's never going to be based on email address, of course, because that's a primary key within the software. But once you do have a number of suspected matches that the software has pulled up, then you can go in and decide, obviously, which of those records you want to merge to and which fields you want to keep. There were some great suggestions actually this morning on being able to show also the engagement score here, so that you can actually see which of those email addresses is actually being engaged with more actively than the other one. And there was another suggestion to actually look at the opt-in status for each of those records, because actually if you're going to merge them, then obviously what opt-in status, you can manually do that, but actually you might want to be able to more easily see here on this screen which opt-in statuses each of those records have. So when you merge them, you're actually doing something which is obviously very intentional. But this process now is up and running, and we have a few green pieces using it, I know. But the idea is, in general, we're never going to be a huge enterprise database. That's not what we aspire to be. We're really an engagement platform, but we do have organizations that use us as a database of record, and there are organizations that would like some of that matching to happen here. And so this is one of the things that we implemented this year, in addition to a mass merge process as well from an upload file that you can do.
And where's the duplicate detection housed? What section?
John?
It's under data and reports, so
Okay.
the item is far over right, and under the data section, there should be managed duplication.
And is that where you put the settings in?
Yeah, so for managed duplication, you can then select which fields you want.
So this is not something that's available now?
Yep, no, it was released this, yeah.
Yeah, not shown. So
It needs to be, it needs to be turned on in an account. If you want it, just email support and we can turn it on.
Okay, so that's step one.
Still, like I said, still trying to figure out all this stuff.
Yeah, email Josh. So that's that. We also introduced the other CRM function was this thing for households. So we created this so that you can essentially link records together and establish a relationship between effectively a parent record and other records that sit within it. And so this is something that we had a number of people looking for us to implement. I think it was mostly for in dashboard use. Because organizations, when, for example, they were looking at an individual record, they wanted to see what the household was. Again, there was some good discussion this morning around if you do have a household and you've got multiple records, in terms of using secondary email address for bulk email marketing, there's some stuff there that definitely we would like to do to make that process a little more seamless as well. So. And this is just the asset libraries that we changed this year. So we created obviously a much more user-friendly set of tools for you to be able to actually look at images and other content that you're putting into the asset library and you're using in your emails, landing pages, et cetera. And we wanted to make sure that you could do things like crop and edit and whatever in the way that we used to have it. You used to have to essentially reduce the file size before you could upload it, and there were other sort of very basic things you could do with the file, but very limited. So now you have a much more robust tool basically available to you for managing assets within your account. There was a lot of other stuff that came out this year. For example, obviously the membership, as I mentioned, from Legacy Pages is being moved in the last release of the year. E-commerce has just come out. We also released, what do you call them for giving pages? Premium giving pages, there we go. So, if you give at least $100, then, WWF sends you a plush panda or something or whatever. So obviously premium giving pages were important for some of our public broadcasting clients as well. And so we introduced premium giving, and that was done relatively early in the year, actually, I think back in sort of an April-May release. And there's a full list of things that, this is not the limit. This is just some of the headline pieces that we've released in 2018. There was stuff like adding Stripe as a payment processor, split receipting, so that was something that a lot of organizations wanted. Again, the reason we did it is because we had e-commerce coming. And e-commerce, for example, if you're issuing a tax receipt, you want to make sure that you actually only make a portion of that receivable and a portion of it not receivable. So we basically introduced what's called split receipting. And again, that's the way that we logically bundle things together because one thing is being done that kind of fits with something else. John, can you think of anything else major, not all the small stuff? There was a lot of other small enhancements and other things that we did. Stuff for other payment gateways like WorldPay, PayPal, things like pending transaction management, PayPal. There was a bunch of stuff that we did, but again, they don't tend to make the list, but there's a lot going on that we don't actually put in the main roadmap itself. So any questions about 2018? So as usual, we've been very busy bees, putting all this stuff together and getting it out. And the other thing I should mention, it's not really related to technology, but if you haven't been in the E-Academy, but we've actually committed a lot of resource at the end of last year, not just doing accreditation for agency partners, but also creating a huge number of learning modules with videos on the Academy. And so the Engaging Networks Academy is something that I really encourage you to have a look at because there's a lot of very, very helpful resources available on the Academy for you to use. Okay. As I mentioned this morning, the 2019, there's a few things we're going to be doing, but one of the things that I want to start off talking about is something called technical debt. The definitions here. Technical debt is a concept in software development that reflects the implied cost of additional rework caused by choosing an easy solution now instead of using a better approach that would take longer. This is something which we are not scared to take on as a company, and we do this every few years. We do not want to accumulate technical debt in the platform. If you accumulate every platform has some. If you accumulate too much, then over time it becomes very hard to develop anything efficiently because you've got just tons of crap in there that's been built on and built on and built on and built on, and sometimes you really just need to rip stuff out, start again. And the reason that companies are loath to do that is that obviously it means you have to now expend a lot of resource essentially rebuilding stuff that's already sort of 80% there. But the problem with the 80% there is that the 20% that you need to build now means it's getting built on top of that 80% that you really should change. And so then the next time you do it and you do it again and you do it again and you do it again, you get to the point now where you've got a code base which is virtually unmanageable. So technical debt is something that we like to avoid completely. One of the reasons that we've now kind of think of 2019 as being an important year for us to manage technical debt is that the last membership page type, which is being moved from the legacy tools to Page Builder, now means that we can go into all the Page Builder stuff, look at whatever's being used, the old legacy tools, we can go into that code base, look at whatever's being used that is still useful within the software application, and basically rebuild that and get rid of everything else. And so, this was a really good, it's now, 2019 is a good year for us to basically go in, look critically at what the code base is doing, how it's set up, how it's configured, where we're going in terms of our strategic development plan for the next year or two, and basically clean stuff up. And so we're a little bit, 2019 is a slightly kind of introspective year. We're not, a lot of our previous years have been years where we add. And so we've been adding new modules, new features, new services, and keep expanding basically the breadth of engaging networks as a platform, which is a good thing because, and we could keep doing that to some degree, but now we have events, we have peer-to-peer, we have, the first version of e-commerce, we've obviously got our advocacy tool set, we've got fundraising, premium giving, we've got all this stuff that's out there. How much more do we want to kind of keep building versus kind of taking a step back and looking at some of the core functionality within the software and thinking a little bit more closely about how we can improve the infrastructure we've already built. So 2019 is very much a year in which we're going to be looking at technical debt, and we're also going to be looking at the whole reporting. And when I say reporting, it's kind of like a throwaway category for everything that we do around reporting. And it's not just the reports that you can view, but it's, for example, filtering data to be able to build those reports dynamically, looking at canned reports, which ones are available, which kind of data do you need, building audiences, connecting up some of the data that we already have in things like, for example, an email engagement score, or some of the profile stuff that we're collecting for you that use in marketing automation. So we've got a lot of stuff throughout the software where we are looking at things like email engagement scoring, and can we go into email engagement scoring and make that a more dynamic process where you can actually configure some of those parameters yourselves? If we want to do that around email engagement scoring, then how are we storing all that email data? Is it something that we can actually aggregate, put into a reporting environment, and actually return to you very quickly within a reasonable query period, and actually deliver against? So when you get into things like reporting, building audiences, anything, whether it's downloadable dashboard reports, doesn't matter. How data is structured and how data is held and how data is managed is actually central to that whole conversation. It's not just about creating some sort of a nicer front end, because the nicer front end really has to relate to how all the data is engineered in the back. So we want to spend essentially a 6-month period from January to June and make everything around looking at all the inventory and all the data that we currently hold, how we hold that within the database, which database is it in? Is it in the transactional Oracle database? Is it something that gets aggregated? Is it something that DB Visit, which is a technology we use to basically update our reporting environment, is it there? How does it relate to our machine learning program? So the focus is going to be on obviously dynamic report building, which is going to be something that again we'd like to take a look at from scratch. Create obviously more downloadable reports. We only have that one really available for email ROI, and you can get the other data on advocacy in other ways, but we again want to rationalize that, and I think that some of the download reports that you can configure are something which has been really useful for email, and we want to be able to extend that into other areas of the platform. We want to expand the filtering options using things like origin source. So this year we created this technology around origin source so that you can create a designated value to identify the origin source for an individual constituent record. We hold other data along with that, but apart from being able to access that information, how is it being leveraged? How can you use it? To be able to actually build audiences, report on. So you've assigned a specific code as an origin source for someone that you've done an acquisition campaign from, and you want to see what the lifetime value is of all donors through that particular campaign. Right now, there's no way for you to be able to do that dynamically within the software, but that obviously is the plan. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we want to do in terms of looking at how we store data, what data we store, where it's available, how it integrates for things like profiles, engagement scoring, downloadable reports, what kind of filters we can provide, what reports are missing, as well as also just the visual reporting within the dashboard itself. So this is a major, major project for us, and it's our priority for the first 6 months of 2019. One of the things that we're really determined to do on all of this is that once we are able to kind of create almost like a mini white paper and kind of show you what we're thinking about and the areas that we want to overhaul within reporting, audience building, et cetera, is we want to start a consultation on that to make sure that we get your input. So you tell us what kind of data you need to do things like build audiences, build reports, downloadable reports versus dashboard reports, which ones you use, et cetera. So we have a lot of fantastic data. It's all accessible, but actually we want to rationalize all that and make it even easier to use and more effective for you ultimately. Does that make sense? Yep. So this is a big focus for us in 2019. We are going to expand a little bit wide. We're trying to contain ourselves, but there is some stuff that we want to do. I've talked about the e-commerce extension, obviously. Survey is something that we had really wanted to get out this year. The reason it was deferred, there was a couple of reasons it was deferred, but surveys, first of all, we don't think there's that many organizations that are using it. Some will, but actually building the survey within Page Builder is not really a huge resource commitment. It's literally probably 3 weeks worth of development, but it's the reporting side of the survey. So being able to actually then, find out what the overall responses was, how we're showing that information to you, et cetera. So because that's such an important part of surveys, we deferred it because we're actually doing the reporting overhaul. So that again is logically why we put things together, because so much of surveys is about reporting the data and being able to use that. We thought let's roll that into the reporting exercise that we're doing in the first half of 2019. The other thing we're talking about here is aggregated advocacy messages. In the States, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because in the US it's very unique. Obviously, we deliver messages through a congressional API to to the House. I'm not sure if the Senate uses any of it actually. The Senate's all those ridiculous forms. But in other markets, though, where, for example, Germany, they find it very irritating to send individual politicians literally thousands of individual messages, and they would rather have some way of aggregating messages. And we have another tool in our legacy dashboard called the Political Exchange, which was essentially a two-way kind of community between politicians and supporters of individual organizations and issues. You could, for example, send out a broadcast email, ask candidates during an election campaign whether they supported your issue, and depending on what they declared, if they declared anything, if they said, yes, I support it, I don't support it, whatever, they could write some personal comments, and people living in their district, whenever they went to write messages, would have customized messaging based on the response of the issue by each of the candidates. So they could see how their candidates had responded to the issue, and they could get a different template message that you want them to send. So we actually had a very sophisticated product called the Political Exchange, but we want to get rid of that and roll it into some new kind of shared community between politicians and individual supporters, so that there's kind of more of a conversation going on as opposed to just kind of sending in messages. It might be somewhat limited in terms of application in the US only because of the process, which has been established for essentially having individuals speak to politicians. And that was the other thing I forgot that we implemented this year, which was the regulations.gov tool, which is now available for you to as well, because obviously that was a whole little bit of gymnastics in itself. So, but that's available. So we are going to expand the platform a little bit, and Page Builder, these are the only 3 new page types essentially that we're looking at building. The aggregated advocacy messages is really going to get pushed back to the end of next year. Surveys is going to happen with the reporting stuff, and e-commerce, as soon as we can kind of figure out the approach we want to take for physical gifts, then that's going to get scheduled at some point. But we obviously want to make sure that it's available well before year end of next year, so that people can use it for year end stuff. Questions? Okay. The hub is, again, I talked about this morning a little bit. It's this, you can set up a hub through Page Builder, and the hub is a place where your supporters can log in via an email link. And when they go into the hub, there's a series of gadgets that you can populate. So for example, there's a gadget which, if someone has given money to a previous fundraising campaign that you've run, and you've updated what's happened to that fundraising campaign, that content gets populated in the gadget in the hub, so that someone who is now given to that campaign can say, oh, what happened to the money that I gave the organization? And then you update it in Page Builder for that particular fundraising page that you built. And then that content, again, gets populated. It's all dynamic, so it's only for individuals that have actually taken part in that fundraising campaign. So if they haven't, they won't get that particular content. Initially, it was obviously focused very much on trying to encourage an individual to at least self-manage a recurring gift if they wanted to change the credit card, or if they wanted to update, for example, certain address information. So those gadgets are available, obviously, within the hub. But again, we think that there's a huge amount of potential for the hub to become a much more, or much larger, broader engagement tool. So that for probably 80 or 90% of your supporters that really just respond to email, make a donation once a year, or maybe they're a recurring donor, maybe they sign the occasional petition, they may not be actively going into the hub to do anything. But for those sort of 10, 15, 20% of super active supporters, the hub can become a place where they can actually get a sense of what you're doing with their involvement on very specific campaigns. You could suggest, for example, next actions for them to take. They can obviously self-manage things like data, recurring gifts. You know, obviously there's no gadget currently for peer-to-peer, so peer-to-peer needs to be pulled into a separate gadget. So we'd also like to do some work on the hub. This is, again, more introspective because we've already built the hub. So we're just trying to sort of see how we can kind of maybe expand it a little bit and make it a bit more interesting. But I think it's got a huge amount of potential. We'll have to see how that goes. Has anyone got a hub set up in your account? Okay. Right, it's the wrong crowd. So that's really as far as we've gotten in terms of our thinking. There are a lot of other things that we actually have on a kind of a wish list, stuff that we've taken in from clients and other sources, but it's really what I wanted to lay out in terms of technology for 2019, except for machine learning, which I'm going to get to right now. You know, between the massive overhaul for reporting, some of the extension around Page Builder, the work on the hub, you know, a lot of the other minor features and adjustments and things that we're going to be adding to the technology as well throughout the year. But the other big focus is our machine learning program. And I'm not going to get, everyone knows what machine learning is? Okay, I asked that completely wrong. Does anyone not know what machine learning is? Now no one's going to raise their hand. Okay, sorry. So machine learning is essentially a discipline of artificial intelligence. So it's just, you know, it's AI, but it's a sort of an approach to AI. And it focuses obviously on using applications and algorithms that live within those applications to be able to have machines effectively learn. So I'll explain that a little bit. Actually, I'll explain it now at the outset. So the idea is that you can build an application that has algorithms embedded in it. Typically, the applications are built in Python or R. Ours are built in Python or being built in Python. And the application, the algorithms, essentially are using what we call training data. It's all about solving a problem. So you're saying, well, here's the problem we'd like to solve. Here's the use case, whatever that use case happens to be. And we would like this machine to work out the solution to this particular problem. And so what you do is you give the application with the algorithms within it access to training data so it can then start predicting behavior. And as they start basically becoming capable of predicting behavior, all of a sudden now those machines are making decisions that are helping you solve that problem without the need for you to actually, physically intervene in that process. So you're essentially using massive amounts of training data. And again, the best example, which I repeated again this morning, was the Google, one of the early Google experiments where they set up a whole bunch of servers like the brain's, to replicate effectively the brain's neural network. When they set up the server infrastructure, they then built an application with an algorithm to look frame by frame at 10 million cat videos. And the objective, the problem, was that they wanted the application to be able to identify a video that had a cat in it. And after a week of looking at 10 million cat videos, frame by frame, this application was able to accurately, I think 99-point-something% of the time, identify a video that had a cat in it. So that's a classic application of machine learning using data or deep learning to be able to solve a problem, whatever the problem is. I'm not sure that you guys would identify saying that, identifying videos with cats is a problem, but that's what they were doing. So, so when you think about it from just a logical point of view, what you need if you're doing machine learning is you need data. So you need to have that data available to be able to teach the algorithms and the applications to essentially predict behavior for whatever problem it is you're trying to solve. Obviously, the applications are doing the work to be able to analyze and then predict behavior. And then you have what we call integrate or implement, really, in our case. So if I was to say, for example, the problem for any nonprofit is that you are challenged in getting single donors who have never made a monthly gift to become a monthly donor. So that's the use case, that's the problem, that's the challenge. And you want to use machine learning to do that. So if we have heaps of data, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, that is actually doing the analysis and now predicting behavior and now suggesting to you, for example, a marketing stream to be able to more effectively convert each individual single donor to becoming a monthly recurring donor, you're not going to want to know that academically or something in an Excel spreadsheet. You want that to be implemented. You want to automate that. So there's no point basically putting all this in data together, using the intelligence to work out what is the most effective way to upsell a single donor to a monthly donor, and then basically not automate the implementation of that. So there's three basic components to this. You need the data, you need the algorithms, you need the data science, and then you need to be able to, once you get that predictive behavior and now you've got solutions for it, you need to be able to implement that in an automated way. Does that make sense? Okay. So starting with data, so I'm going to take each of those three buckets basically sequentially. So there's data obviously that we have, there's data outside of engaging networks, and there's data that we can derive to some extent. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of focus on this, but obviously we have the constituent data, so we know whatever data has been held as part of a constituent record. We have massive amounts of transaction data, so we know, for example, when someone made a donation, how much they gave, what the date was, whether they were applying to an email appeal, how many emails they received before it, how many received after it. There's heaps of transactional information that we have around their digital engagement within engaging networks. You could do things like you can append other information potentially, like social profile, website content, what pages they're looking on your website. It could be offline data if someone's volunteering, if someone's responding to direct mail. So there's lots of other data that we don't have in engaging networks, but that could also be used to now put into that big pool of data. And obviously there's external data, things like Wealth Engine or whatever. And there's a lot of issues, especially under GDPR, around which data you actually have permission to use. But one of the areas that I think is the most important is the data that relates to what type of content you're marketing to your supporters. So you send out an emailed appeal, and someone decides to click through and makes a donation. What was in that email appeal that convinced that individual to make the donation? Was it an image that had, a happy cat or an unhappy cat? Or was it a certain reading level? Was it a huge amount of text? What was the emotion behind it? What was the issue? What was the topic? So there's a huge amount of data that we can collect about the content that you're marketing to your supporters. And that becomes part of the overall data set that then the machine learning program uses to be able to look for patterns to predict behavior. And I think that this kind of data is one of the critical data sets which is completely missing. So we now have 2 people hired through Accessible Intelligence, which is the sister company. They're both owned by me, but basically we've set it up as a separate business. Basically going through and manually assigning values amongst 40 different categories for landing pages and emails. Right now, we're only doing it on training data that we have access to. That's been, obviously, we have permission to use. But the reason that we have 2 people doing that is that if you look at the natural language processing tools, like this one, for example, made available by Google, they're completely inadequate for being able to actually build a database around the type of content that you're using to market to your supporters. So if you look here, for example, where it says location, it says it's the ground. So this is kind of a machine learning application which is trying to do natural language processing and categorize certain types of communication. When we put this email from Humane Society International into that particular natural language processor, it came up with complete rubbish. What you really want to know is you want to know actually, what's the email type? It's an ask. Is it a donation? Is it in terms of relevance, is it timely? Is it, an emergency appeal? Is it, what's the emotion? What's the sentiment, et cetera? 3 minutes? That's it? Okay, all right. Well, I'm about to speed up. So we have basically 2 people now that are going out and assigning values to categories to classify content in training data. And I think it's going to be very unique. And in November, I hope, along with the membership page, you'll start seeing a button on your pages or emails that you can click up to see what values our team have assigned to various content categories within the software. And you'll have an opportunity to actually help us learn and say, hey, do this, don't do this. By the way, none of this is going to happen without your permission. So no one's data is just being rolled into this. You guys will have to very consciously decide to be a part of this or not be a part of this. This is not happening without consent. We actually looked again at specific data for HSI, which we've been using as some of this training data. And for example, looking at the one category of emotion, joy was in 40% of the emails, hope was 31%, fear 6.6%, 20% was revulsion, 0.5% other. So the idea behind this, and this is why it's so critical, is that we're essentially now creating a database of information about what it is you are marketing to your supporters, because now we can understand what they're responding to and when they respond to it. Does that make sense? Okay, the middle box, so after data, so we're building up the data sets. The middle box, which is like the data science. Again, our data scientist, Gordon Walsh, it's great. Again, I said this morning, but every time I get off the phone, I think I'm more confused than when I got on. But he said to me, the algorithm will classify supporters into groups that will likely be non-interpretable. So the first step in our machine learning program is actually classifications. And I explained this morning, but for example, and the reason that they're non-interpretable is that we won't necessarily know why the algorithms, which are typically new forest, nearest neighbor, are using it. So what we want to do is we want to find people within your database that are similar, that belong in a classification, a grouping. And so the algorithm might go through and say, you guys are all part of one classification, you're similar, you're all alike, you're all similar, and you guys on the counter, you're all similar too. So it's created 3 different classifications. We can actually direct the algorithms to decide what data it looks at when it's creating those classifications. We can also tell it how many classifications we want and what the minimum number is, but we won't necessarily always understand once we've given it that data why it came up and decided that all of you were very similar. But that's the first step, is basically working out classifications for supporters using an algorithm. And again, typically the one that we're using is random forest. It's essentially a decision tree algorithm. So that's something that's the classifications. Once you have, they're called unsupervised algorithms, but once you have the classifications done, now you're saying for a specific use case, I want to upsell single donors to monthly donors. That's my use case. Now you're using what are called clustered algorithms, and you're saying, well, for everyone in grouping A, what is the best way to market for those supporters that are single donors that are not yet monthly donors? And what it's going to do is it's going to look at all the people in group A that have successfully been upsold from a single gift to a monthly gift, and it's going to look at all that data as training data to work out what is the best way to do that, to make that happen. Then every time someone comes into classification A or is classified as an A, you're a single donor, you haven't given a monthly gift, we now have a marketing stream. The algorithm is going to propose a marketing stream to convince you guys to become monthly donors as opposed to just being a single donor. Does that make sense? The marketing stream it comes out with you guys might be completely different than the marketing stream for Bs or Cs or Ds or Es. And the other thing is, which I didn't mention this morning, is that, for example, it might be that we end up with classifications and also subclassifications so that the training data is actually for animal welfare organizations. There's a separate set of training data for international development. Maybe it's by country, maybe it's by whatever, but it's unlikely that we're going to actually find that kind of consistency across things like markets, different types of verticals, and so on and so forth. So the training data is likely to be different for different groups or subsets of groups. Organizations that then come into the machine learning program have the option of just having their data run against the training data and then spits out the marketing stream, for example, for people in different classifications for this specific use case. Or it might be something where you can add your data, then the model basically gets updated, the training data gets updated, and the model gets rerun because now your data being added to it has maybe affected the way in which the marketing stream should actually perform. There's a lot of other stuff that happens in fine-tuning of the algorithms to prevent bias, et cetera, but I'm not going to get into all that. But there's a lot of that going on at the same time. But the idea is effectively you're saying you have a new supporter that's in group A, the algorithm has worked and it knows what the ideal marketing stream is to convince that single donor to become a monthly donor, and now you're going to go and spit it out. The one thing that we're doing now, before we start building some of those algorithms for each of our 4 priority use cases, is to look at analytics. So for example, in this one set of data that we looked at, supporters with high levels of activism either after they became a monthly donor have longer retention before they stop regular donation, for those that do drop out eventually, of around 40% longer. So what we start doing is we start doing analytics, and we start thinking about, okay, well, if we want the machine learning program to look at certain types of data and absorb certain types of hypotheses, what we do is we do one-off analytics initially, and we do the analytics so that we can inform the algorithms. So you do the analytics as kind of like a precursor to this whole process. Then, once you've now got the marketing stream for everybody in classification A, that's a single donor that's not yet a monthly donor, you have to automate that. And so we obviously have fantastic marketing automation tools, but we are building out a whole series of screens now that are going to look at, for example, here's 4 cases: single donors, next gift upsell, single donors to recurring, activist to donor, activist multiplier, trying to get your activists doing more actions, for example. There's an endless number: retention, donor retention, activist retention. There's a whole range of use cases or problems that machine learning can be set to solve. When you look at, for example, one of those use cases, if it's active, then we'll show you, we just put up 4 classifications here where you can see things like, for example, well, okay, what's the reporting what's happening against the benchmark for people within this particular classification? Do I want to go in and update some of the content in the content library that's being sent out to people within this particular classification? Do I want to make any other kind of adjustments to it? The funny thing is that everyone wants to go in and fiddle with this, but actually that defeats the purpose. The point of machine learning is that it actually, it's doing the job for us. As soon as you start manipulating or trying to change things, like for example, change the marketing stream, what you're doing is you're effectively building bias in. So the idea is that you'd be able to look at now, for example, the marketing stream. You'd be able to see, again, we've just put up 3 simple emails here. This one, just middle one, showing you there's content that's missing. And so how are we managing the content? Well, what we want you to do is to build content libraries that mirror the content classification. That's the really smart thing. So now that we actually have the algorithms looking at the marketing stream for everyone in classification A, it's not only going to tell us when we should send them an email, but it's also going to suggest what type of email we should send. So if it's now going to do that in an automated way, then we need to have content libraries that can pick that content and send it. And so there's a whole infrastructure that we're building around essentially proposing the type of content that you need to satisfy the content libraries, and for example, suggesting other types of emails that satisfy most of that, if not all of it, so you can load that and just change the image or change some of the reading level or the tone or the type of appeal, etc. So every time, that's kind of like the crux of this, is that the marketing stream that we're suggesting is not just timing and when you send an email, but it's actually what you're sending them. And what you're sending them gets mapped to the content classification, and it gets mapped back to your content libraries. Does that make sense? It's very cool stuff, by the way. So where are we? This will be my second to last slide. So we've already created the data flows between accessible intelligence and engaging networks. We've created the network infrastructure, which we're already working on, or Gordon is working on. We have the content classification now. We built an entire application, which is up and running, which Melis and Hannah are using to actually classify content for training data that's been, again, given for us to use with permission. The data science, we're now doing trial modeling data, and we're also doing all the analytics and questions to be able to kind of inform the algorithms that we need to build for each of those use cases. And again, we're starting with 4 priority use cases. On the implementation, we're starting, basically, it's the functionality. Most of it already exists, but we're also going to be looking at reporting and automation libraries. This work has started, but really just from a design point of view. We haven't actually implemented anything yet on this, but we're going to be leveraging our marketing automation tools to be able to do this more effectively. And yeah, for engaging networks clients, it's going to be completely seamless. So you basically have engaging networks as a platform. That's obviously all the data that we need. Accessible intelligence is essentially where the data science is happening. It's through this company called Accessible Intelligence. And then obviously the recommendations for things like the marketing stream is being put back for implementation into engaging networks. So from your point of view, actually, you're just in engaging networks. Like nothing changes, nothing is different, everything just kind of life goes on. The reason that this has been done this way is so that we can also use accessible intelligence to produce marketing streams and other solutions for specific use cases in the nonprofit world for organizations that don't use engaging networks. So that basically the data can still go into accessible intelligence. Accessible intelligence can use, the data science can work, and then we can produce basically an output through whatever tool is set up to do that. So this won't be, the service won't be uniquely available to engaging networks, but the integration will be the most seamless, obviously, for engaging networks clients, because actually you won't see anything. You'll just see the implementation. Exciting, no? So I think, we've been doing this now for 14 months. It's taken, we're literally standing up our entire machine learning program within 18 months, which is pretty incredible. So we've been hard at work for the last 14 months. We've got about another 4 or 5 months to go before we actually finish some of the implementation for this. So it'll probably be May. April, I suppose. and for all four, but we should be able to get one up running before then. So it's been a ton of work, but it really is going to be very transformational in terms of your ability to look at and leveraging machine learning to look at specific use cases that you plan to solve. So this is going on at the same time that we're doing the other work on the core platform itself throughout 2019.